Captain Deho was drinking his morning coffee when the emergency signal came through his ship's radio. The sound was broken and full of static, but he could make out a few words. "Help us," and screaming. The signal was coming from Kepler 442b, a small mining colony 3 days away from his current position. Deho had delivered supplies to that colony many times before. The people there were friendly and always happy to see new faces in their quiet corner of space. Something was very wrong. The signal kept repeating the same broken message over and over again, but no one answered when Deho tried to call them back. He changed course immediately. His cargo ship. Peaceful Journey was not built for rescue missions, but he could not ignore people in trouble. His small crew of 3 gathered in the main cabin to discuss what they might find when they arrived. Engineer Hai Jin was worried. She had worked on mining colonies before and knew how dangerous they could be, deep underground. Mining sometimes released toxic gases or caused cave-ins that trapped workers. But this signal was different. It mentioned screaming, which suggested something was attacking the colonists. Security Officer Taemin checked his weapons and suggested they should call for military backup. But the nearest military ship was 2 weeks away, and the colonists might not have that much time. The journey to Kepler 442b took 3 long days. During that time, they received no more signals from the colony. The silence was worse than the broken distress call. At least when the radio crackled with static, they knew someone was still alive down there. Now there was nothing but empty space and the hum of their own engines. Deho found himself checking the communication equipment every few hours, hoping for any sign of life. When they finally arrived at the colony, everything looked normal from orbit. The lights were on in the main buildings. The atmosphere processors were working perfectly. The solar panels gleamed in the sunlight of the distant star. It looked like a peaceful mining operation where people lived and worked without any problems, but no one answered their calls and no ships moved between the surface and the orbital platform. Deho decided to land near the main settlement. The colony was built in a valley surrounded by red rocky hills. The mining tunnels went deep into those hills, searching for rare metals that were valuable across the galaxy. About 200 people lived and worked here, making it one of the smaller colonies in this sector of space. Most of them were families who had come here looking for a better life, away from the crowded worlds near Earth. The landing pad was empty, which was strange. Usually when a supply ship arrived, there were workers waiting to help unload cargo and children excited to see visitors from other worlds. The silence felt heavy and wrong, like the air before a thunderstorm. Taemin was the first to step outside, his hand resting on his weapon as he scanned the area for threats. Everything looked peaceful, but something invisible made the hair on his neck stand up. They walked toward the main administration building, their footsteps echoing oddly in the quiet streets. The buildings were made of white metal that reflected the orange sunlight. The streets were clean and well-maintained, with small gardens between the houses where colonists grew vegetables and flowers. Everything suggested a happy, productive community. But there were no people anywhere to be seen. Inside the first building, they found him. Colonist Sang-woo was sitting in a corner of what used to be the reception area. His eyes were wide with terror, and when he saw them, he opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. He pointed frantically at his throat and shook his head. His face was pale and thin, like he had not eaten properly in days. He kept looking at the ceiling as if something dangerous might come down from above. More colonists appeared from other rooms and from hiding places behind furniture. All of them were silent. All of them looked terrified. They tried to talk to Deho and his crew, but their mouths only moved without making any sound. Some of them were crying, but even their tears fell silently. Their voices had been taken away by something, and from the way they acted, that something was still nearby, watching and waiting. Hai Jin knelt down beside a young woman who was holding a baby. The baby was also silent, which was the most disturbing thing of all. Babies cry when they are hungry or scared or uncomfortable. But this child made no sound, even though its face was red and its mouth was open. The woman pointed to papers scattered on a desk. Hye-jin picked them up and saw they were research notes about strange creatures that had come up from the deep mining tunnels. The notes were written by Dr. Yuna, the colony's chief scientist. She had been studying something called acoustic feeders, creatures that ate sound itself. The more afraid people became, the louder they screamed and the stronger the creatures grew. It was a horrible cycle where terror created the very food that made the monsters more powerful. The notes ended abruptly 3 weeks ago, with a single line written in shaky handwriting, "They are coming up tonight," as the sun began to set behind the rocky hills. Dae-ho understood why all the colonists were silent, and why they kept looking at the shadows between buildings. Something moved in the darkness at the edge of his vision. When he turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there, but he could feel eyes watching him and hear the faint scraping sound of claws against metal. The first creature appeared when full darkness fell. It looked like a shadow that had been given form and hunger. Its body was black and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It had too many teeth that gleamed white in its dark face and claws that sparked when they touched the metal. Buildings. But the most terrifying thing about it was how it reacted to sound. Taemin accidentally kicked a small metal container while backing away from the creature. The sound of metal hitting stone rang out clearly in the quiet night. Instantly, the shadow monster turned toward them. Its body seemed to grow larger and more solid, as if the sound itself was feeding it. More creatures appeared from other dark places between the buildings, all of them drawn by that single small noise. The colonists, who had been hiding nearby, pressed themselves against the walls in absolute terror. Their mouths opened in silent screams, but they had learned not to make any sound at all. Even the smallest noise would bring the creatures running, and the louder the sound, the more powerful the monsters became. The people of this colony had discovered that their own voices had become weapons pointed at themselves. Dae-ho and his crew learned very quickly why everyone was silent. They spent their first night on the colony, pressed against the walls like the colonists, moving only when they had to and communicating through desperate hand signals. The creatures prowled the streets all night long, searching for any sound that might feed their terrible hunger. And in the morning, when the monsters retreated to dark places, the humans remained silent because they knew the creatures were still there, waiting for someone to make a mistake. The mining colony had become a prison of silence, where the most human thing of all, the ability to speak and cry and laugh and sing, had become the thing that could kill them. And somewhere in the darkness, the creatures that fed on screams were growing stronger with each passing night, waiting for fear to overcome caution and fill their world with the sounds of terror once again. The creatures were unlike anything in the galactic database. Hye-jin spent hours looking through her computer files, trying to find something similar, but there was nothing. These monsters were completely new to human science. She decided to call them shriekers because of the horrible noise they made when they fed on sound. The name fit perfectly, because hearing them eat was one of the most disturbing experiences anyone could imagine. During the day, the shriekers hid in dark places like the mining tunnels, storage rooms, and spaces between buildings. They seemed to hate bright light and preferred shadows where their black bodies could blend in perfectly. But when night came, they emerged to hunt, moving through the colony streets, like living nightmares, searching for any sound they could consume. The crew watched in horror from a safe hiding place as a group of colonists tried to reach the supply depot. The colonists had been without food for 2 days and were desperate enough to risk the journey. They moved carefully, trying to stay quiet, but one of them stepped on broken glass. The tiny tinkling sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent night. Instantly, 3 shriekers appeared from nowhere, converging on the group, like sharks smelling blood. What happened next would give Daeho nightmares for the rest of his life. The colonists panicked when they saw the monsters, and their fear made them scream. The creatures seemed to drink in those screams like water. Their bodies became more solid, more real with each terrified sound. As the humans screamed louder, the shriekers grew bigger and stronger. It was feeding time, and the monsters were enjoying their meal. The largest shrieker was now twice the size it had been when it first appeared. Its claws were longer, its teeth were sharper, and its black body rippled with stolen energy. The creature made a sound like laughter but wrong, and twisted as if joy itself had been corrupted. The other monsters circled the screaming. Humans like wolves around prey, taking turns to absorb the acoustic energy that poured from their victims. One colonist tried to run but stumbled and fell. His cry of pain was like ringing a dinner bell for the creatures. 2 more shriekers materialized. From the shadows drawn by the fresh sound of fear and desperation, they fought over the fallen man, not with claws and teeth, but with competing attempts to absorb his screams. The man was still alive, but his voice was getting weaker, as if the monsters were draining more than just sound from him. Dr. Yuna had been studying these creatures for weeks before she lost her voice to fear. She had filled notebooks with observations and theories about how they worked. The shriekers came from deep underground, brought to the surface by the mining operations that had disturbed their ancient sleeping places. They fed on acoustic energy, but not just any sound. They preferred the complex, chaotic vibrations that came from living beings in distress. The research notes explained that fear made voices shake and break, creating the exact type of sound waves that nourished the creatures. A calm, steady voice had little energy for them to consume, but a terrified scream was like a feast. The more afraid someone became, the more their voice changed, and the more the shriekers could feed. It was a perfect trap where the natural human response to danger became the thing that made the danger worse. Daeho tried to organize a rescue mission for the colonists, trapped in the depot, but every attempt ended in disaster. When they started the transport engines, the sound drew dozens of creatures from hiding places throughout the colony. The monsters swarmed toward the noise, like insects drawn to light, forcing the crew to shut everything down and retreat to safety. Communication became a nightmare of hand signals and hastily written notes. But even writing made small scratching sounds that attracted the smaller shriekers. These baby monsters were only the size of cats, but they were fast, and their tiny claws could slice through clothing and skin. They seemed to be scouts for the larger creatures, reporting back about any sounds they discovered in their territory. The colony had become a place where every human instinct was wrong. Cough and die. Sneeze and die, trip and cry out in pain and die. The natural sounds that people made without thinking had all become potential death sentences. The colonists had learned to control their breathing, to walk without making footsteps, to even control their heartbeats because the shriekers could hear everything. Taemin discovered that the creatures could sense vibrations through the ground. When he tried to tap out Morse code on the floor, 2 shriekers appeared within minutes. They could feel the tiny impacts through the metal structure of the buildings. Nothing was safe from their hunger for sound and movement. The monsters had found the perfect hunting ground in a human settlement where people naturally made noise just by existing. The psychological pressure was breaking people down faster than hunger or thirst. Several colonists had gone completely mad from the stress of staying silent while living in constant terror. They sat in corners, rocking back and forth with their hands pressed over their mouths to prevent any sound from escaping. Their eyes showed the madness of people who had been pushed beyond what the human mind could endure. Hye-jin noticed that some colonists were starting to make deliberate noise as if they wanted to attract the creatures. It was a form of suicide brought on by weeks of unbearable stress. They preferred to die quickly in the claws of a shrieker rather than slowly waste away in terrified silence. The colony was not just being destroyed by monsters, but by the human inability to live without sound and communication. The shriekers were learning too. They had discovered that humans made the best sounds when they were most afraid. So the creatures began to play games with their prey. They would appear just long enough to be seen, then vanish back into shadows. The psychological torture made people more likely to panic and scream when the monsters finally attacked. It was farming fear to create. Better food young children were the worst affected because they did not understand why they could not speak or play or laugh. Some of them had not made a sound in so long that Hijin worried they might never learn to use their voices again. Even if the shriekers were defeated, the monsters were not just killing people, they were stealing what made humans human. By the end of their second day on the colony, Daeho realized they were trapped in the same prison that held the colonists, the peaceful. Journey was too far away, and the journey to reach it would require crossing open ground where the shriekers could easily hear their footsteps. They were stuck in a place where their own voices had become their greatest enemies. The monsters that fed on screams were growing fat and strong, while the humans grew weak and silent. It seemed like the perfect predator and prey relationship, where the hunters would always win and the hunted would always lose. But somewhere in the colony, a young girl named Bo-Ram was about to prove that assumption wrong. Young colonist Bo-Ram was different from all the other survivors. While everyone else cowered in corners and pressed themselves against walls in terror, she seemed almost calm. Her movements were steady and deliberate, not the jerky, frightened motions of people who had been living in fear for weeks. When other colonists saw shadows moving, they froze like rabbits, but Bo-Ram just watched the darkness with curious eyes instead of afraid ones. Ha-Jin first noticed something strange about the girl. During a dangerous supply run to the medical building, the group had been moving in absolute silence, communicating only through hand signals when Bo-Ram began to hum quietly to herself. It was barely louder than breathing, just a soft, gentle sound. That seemed to come naturally. But what happened next changed everything. They thought they knew about the shriekers. The nearest creature, which had been stalking them from the shadows, suddenly stopped moving instead of rushing toward the sound like every other time. It actually stepped backward, as if the gentle humming had pushed it away. The monster seemed confused, tilting its head like an animal hearing something it could not understand. The other shriekers that had been closing in also retreated, melting back into the darkness like smoke day. Ho could not believe what he was seeing. Every rule they had learned about survival was breaking down before his eyes. Sound attracted the monsters, except when it came from Bo-Ram screaming, fed the creatures except when she made noise. Her quiet humming had driven away predators that grew stronger from every other human sound. It was impossible, but he had witnessed it with his own eyes. The girl had been part of the colony music program before the shrieker attack. Her grandmother had taught her traditional Korean songs passed down through generations of their family. While other children learned to play games or sports, Bo-Ram had spent hours learning melodies that were hundreds of years old. Her young voice had been trained to carry these ancient songs with perfect pitch and rhythm. When the monsters first appeared 3 weeks ago, most colonists had screamed in terror or shouted warnings to their neighbors. But Bo-Ram had done something different. When she saw the first shrieker emerge from the mining tunnels, her natural reaction had been to sing one of her grandmother's lullabies. The soft, steady melody had confused the creature long enough for her to escape to safety. The crew began to realize that the shriekers did not simply feed on sound, but on specific types of acoustic energy. Fear made human voices shake and break, creating chaotic vibrations that the monsters could absorb and convert into strength. But controlled sound, peaceful sound, seemed to have the opposite effect. When Boram sang with confidence and calm, her voice created vibrations that the creatures could not digest. Testing this theory was incredibly dangerous, but they had no choice. The colonists were dying slowly from starvation and terror, while the shriekers grew stronger every night. Something had to change, or everyone would be dead within days. Hyejin convinced Boram to sing louder while they watched from a safe distance, to see how the monsters would react to more powerful music. As the girl's voice rose in a gentle melody that spoke of home and safety and love, the effect on the shriekers was dramatic. They did not just avoid her singing, they seemed to be in actual pain. Their solid black bodies began to flicker and fade as if the pure, fearless music was draining energy back out of them instead of feeding them. The creatures that had grown fat on terror were being starved by songs. 3 shriekers fled from Boram's voice, but one remained. It was larger than the others, probably fed on more screams over the past weeks. This monster tried to fight back against the music. It opened its mouth and released a horrible shriek designed to overwhelm the girls, singing and fill her with fear. But Boram kept singing. Her voice never wavered, never broke, never showed the slightest trace of terror. The battle between song and shriek lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. The monster's scream was full of rage and hunger and ancient hatred. But the girl's lullaby was full of love and memory and human warmth. 2 completely different types of sound fought for control of the air around them. The shrieker's voice was chaos, but Boram's voice was harmony. Slowly, the monster began to shrink. Its body became less solid, less real as the peaceful music continued. The creature tried to flee but seemed unable to move away from the sound that was destroying it, with a final desperate shriek that sounded almost like a cry for help. The shrieker dissolved completely, leaving only empty air where a nightmare had been moments before. Boram finished her song and smiled at the amazed adults who had been watching. She explained in whispers that her grandmother had always told her music could chase away bad dreams. Now it seemed those old stories were more true than anyone had imagined. The songs passed down through generations of her family were not just entertainment, they were weapons against darkness. Discovery changed everything they understood about their situation. The monsters were not invincible. They could be fought and defeated, but not with guns or knives or explosives. The key to victory was something uniquely human: the ability to make beautiful sounds even in the face of terror. The shriekers fed on fear, but they were poisoned by courage expressed through music. Word began to spread through the colony that music could fight the monsters, but this knowledge came with its own problems. Not everyone could sing like Boram. When other colonists tried to copy her, their voices still shook with weeks of accumulated terror. Their songs attracted the creatures instead of driving them away because fear corrupted the music and turned it back into food for the shriekers. Karyuna updated her research notes with this new information. The creatures fed on acoustic chaos but were weakened by acoustic harmony. Fear created chaos in the human voice, while courage created harmony. It was not enough to simply make music. The music had to come from a place of strength and hope, rather than desperation and terror. Daeho realized they needed to teach the colonists how to sing without fear. But how could people who had been living in terror for weeks suddenly find the courage to raise their voices in song? It seemed impossible, yet Boram proved that it could be done. Her grandmother's lullabies had given her something stronger than fear, and now that strength was the key to everyone's survival. The girl offered to teach others the songs her grandmother had taught her, simple melodies that children could learn easily, songs about stars and home and safety that carried centuries of human love and hope. These were not just random tunes, but carefully preserved pieces of culture that had helped people face darkness for generations. The old songs were about to save lives in ways their creators never imagined. Word spread through the colony that music could fight the monsters, But this knowledge came with terrible challenges. Not everyone could sing like Boram. When frightened colonists tried to copy her songs, their voices betrayed them. Weeks of living in terror had damaged more than just their courage. It had broken their ability to make the pure sounds that could drive away the shriekers. Their attempts at singing still attracted the creatures because fear corrupted every note. The problem was deeper than just being scared. Fear had changed how people breathed, how they held their bodies, how they thought about making sound. When someone had spent weeks believing that their voice could kill them, it was almost impossible to suddenly trust that same voice to save them. The colonists. Hearts raced when they tried to sing and racing. Hearts made voices shake and shaking. Voices fed the monsters. Daeho had an idea that came from his time in the military before becoming a cargo ship captain. He had served with soldiers who sang together to build courage during dangerous missions. Groups of people singing the same song created something more powerful than individual voices. It was called harmony, and it had helped scared young soldiers find bravery when they needed it most. He gathered the survivors in the largest safe room and began teaching them the simplest songs he could remember. Children's lullabies that required no musical skill, only the memory of feeling safe and loved. These were songs that parents sang to babies, songs that every human learned before they could walk, songs about Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and other simple melodies that lived deep in human memory. The first attempt was a disaster. 20 people, trying to sing together while terrified, created a horrible, jumbled noise that brought 3 shriekers running. The colonists scattered in panic, and it took hours to gather them again. Several people refused to try singing after, that convinced that music was just another way to die. But Boram encouraged them to keep practicing, reminding them that her grandmother had always said the most important songs were the hardest to learn. Slowly, voices that had been silent for weeks began to join together. Sang-woo, who had been too scared to make any sound at all, started by just mouthing the words. Then he began to whisper them. Finally, his voice joined the group in a soft, gentle version of a lullaby about sleeping safely through the night. It was not perfect, but it was progress engineer Tae-min claimed he could not carry a tune and had never been good at singing. But when the group reached the chorus of a simple song about home, he found himself humming along. His deep voice added strength to the melody, and other colonists began to sing a little louder. His confidence helped others find their own courage. Even Dr. Yuna, who had lost her voice to fear, began to mouth the words of the songs. At first, no sound came out, but gradually she found her voice again. It was weak and shaky at first, but it grew stronger with each song. The woman who had studied the monsters was learning to fight them with something she had never considered before: the power of human music. The first successful group singing happened on their 4th night of practice. 20 humans singing a gentle lullaby together created a sound that made a small pack of shriekers flee from their building. The creatures did not just avoid the music, they seemed to be in pain. Their black bodies flickered and became less solid, as if the combined human voices were draining energy out of them. Encouraged by this success, more colonists joined the singing groups. Children who had been silent for weeks began to remember songs they had learned before the nightmare started. Their young voices were pure and clear, adding sweetness to the adult voices that surrounded them. Families sang together, finding comfort in shared melodies that reminded them of better times, but the creatures were learning too. The larger shriekers began to adapt to this new threat. They stayed further away from the singing groups, but continued to hunt for isolated humans who could not protect themselves with music. Single voices still attracted the monsters unless they were perfectly controlled like Boram's. The battle was becoming more complex. The colony was dividing into those who could sing fearlessly and those who were still too terrified to trust their voices. People who mastered the songs could move freely through areas where shriekers lurked, but those who could not sing remained trapped in their hiding places. The music was creating freedom, but only for some of the survivors. Daeho realized they needed to protect everyone, not just the people who could sing. He organized the colonists into mixed groups where strong singers surrounded weaker ones. The people who could make fearless music became guardians for those who were still learning. The colony was learning that their greatest weapon against the monsters was cooperation. The Shriekers responded by changing their hunting tactics. Instead of attacking groups directly, the creatures began trying to separate singers from their protective groups. They would create distractions or block pathways, forcing people to choose between safety and helping others. It was psychological warfare designed to break up the human cooperation that made their songs so powerful. Boram suggested they needed bigger songs that could protect larger areas. She taught the colonists how to sing in rounds, where one group started a melody and others joined in at different times, creating layered music that filled more space with protective sound. The result was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, human voices weaving together in complex patterns that confused and hurt the monsters. The colony's communication system became their next tool. Hyejin connected speakers throughout the settlement so that singing groups could broadcast their voices to areas where people were still trapped. The amplified human songs reached colonists who had been isolated for weeks. Some of them had given up hope, but hearing other human voices singing fearlessly gave them courage to try joining in. Night after night, the balance of power shifted. The Shriekers that had once ruled the colony through terror were being pushed back by the simple power of human music. The monsters still controlled the deep tunnels and the darkest corners, but they could no longer hunt freely through the streets. The colony was learning to sing itself back to safety, but the largest Shrieker, the one that seemed to lead all the others, was different. It had grown huge by feeding on weeks of terror, and it was not retreating like the smaller creatures. This monster was preparing for war against the humans who dared to fight back with songs. Instead of fleeing from their music, it began making sounds of its own, horrible noises, designed to drown out human voices and fill them with new fear. The final battle between human song and monster scream was coming, and it would test everything. The colonists had learned about the power of their own voices. The creature that had fed on their terror was about to discover what happened when humans refused to be silenced by darkness. The survivors organized themselves into singing squads that moved through the colony like musical armies. Each squad had strong singers like Boram at the center, surrounded by people who were still learning to control their fear. The squads moved from building to building, rescuing isolated colonists and clearing areas that had been controlled by Shriekers for weeks. Their voices grew stronger and more confident with each successful mission. Daeho led the largest squad, which included Tai Min and Hee Jin, along with a dozen colonists who had mastered the art of fearless singing. They moved through the administration district, methodically checking every room and office for survivors. The Shriekers fled before their combined voices like shadows retreating from bright light. Buildings that had been nightmares of silence became safe spaces filled with human song. They found colonist Minho trapped in a storage closet where he had been hiding for 5 days without food or water. He was so weak he could barely stand. But when he heard the rescue squad singing, he began to cry tears of joy and relief. The squad surrounded him with protective music and carried him to safety, their songs keeping the monsters at bay during the dangerous journey. Each successful rescue made the squads braver. The colonists, who had lived in terror for weeks, were remembering what it felt like to be human again. They laughed between songs and told stories about their lives before the Shriekers came. Children who had been silent began to play again using whispered games that would not attract the creatures. The colony was coming back to life, one song at a time, but the largest Shrieker was not retreating like the others. This ancient creature had grown massive by feeding on human terror, and it was not willing to give up its feeding ground without a fight. The monster began to make sounds of its own horrible noises that were not quite screams and not quite music, but something twisted between the two. The creature's sounds were designed to create fear in human hearts. When people heard its voice, their own singing became shaky and uncertain. The monster was trying to turn the colonists' weapon against them by making them too scared to sing properly. It was psychological warfare between species with sound as the battlefield. Dr. Yuna studied the monster's vocalizations and discovered something disturbing. The creature was learning to mimic human music, but corrupting it with fear and hatred. Its twisted songs were designed to get into people's heads and make them doubt their own voices. Several colonists reported nightmares where the monster sang lullabies that turned into screams. The creature's influence was growing, stronger. Each night, its corrupted music spread further through the colony. Some people who had been singing confidently began to hesitate and stumble over familiar melodies. The monster was trying to poison the very songs that had given humans their power against the Shriekers. It was a battle for the soul of human music itself. Daeho realized they needed to do more than just defend themselves. They needed to take the fight directly to the creatures. The singing squads began to actively hunt the smaller Shriekers, using their voices as weapons to force the monsters out of hiding places. The colony was learning to use music not just for protection, but for attack. The first successful hunt happened when Taemin's squad cornered 3 medium-sized Shriekers in the machine shop. Their combined singing created a barrier of sound that prevented the creatures from escaping. As the humans sang louder, the monsters became weaker and less solid. The Shriekers tried to flee, but the music followed them until they dissolved completely into nothing. Word of the successful hunt spread through the colony, giving everyone new hope. The creatures that had seemed unstoppable were being destroyed by human voices raised in courage. The monsters that fed on screams were learning to fear the sound of people who refused to be afraid. But hunting the creatures was dangerous work. The Shriekers fought back with increasing desperation. As they grew weaker, they became more vicious, attacking anyone who came too close. Even while dissolving from the effects of human song, they tried to strike with claws and teeth. Their death throes could seriously injure or kill the singers who were destroying them. The colony needed better tactics, Hye-jin suggested, using the communication system to coordinate attacks between multiple squads. They could surround groups of creatures with singers positioned at different points, creating inescapable barriers of protective music. The Shriekers would be trapped by human voices coming from all directions. The first coordinated attack targeted a nest of small Shriekers that had taken over the school building. 6 singing squads positioned themselves around the structure and began the most complex musical piece the colony had ever attempted. It was a combination of lullabies, work songs, and traditional melodies woven together into something that had never existed before. The effect was devastating to the creatures trapped inside the building. The combined voices of 60 humans singing in perfect coordination created a storm of acoustic energy that the Shriekers could not resist or escape. Their screams of pain and rage filled the air, but they grew weaker with each passing moment. The nest that had contained dozens of monsters was completely destroyed within an hour. The success of the coordinated attack proved that humans could fight back effectively against the creatures that had terrorized them, but it also revealed the true scope of the Shrieker infestation. The colony was home to hundreds of the monsters hiding in every dark corner and underground tunnel. It would take weeks of dangerous work to clear them all out. The largest Shrieker responded to the successful attacks by becoming more aggressive. Its twisted songs grew louder and more disturbing, affecting colonists even when they were in groups protected by other singers. The creature was preparing for a final confrontation that would determine whether humans or monsters would control the colony. Boram proposed a daring plan. Instead of fighting the large Shrieker with many small attacks, they should gather every person in the colony for one massive song that would be too powerful for any creature to resist. It would be dangerous because if the plan failed, everyone would be in one place where the monster could attack them all at once. But the alternative was a long, slow war of attrition, where people would die one by one while the creature grew stronger. From their fear, the colony had learned to fight, but now they needed to learn to win completely. The final battle would require every human voice raised together in a song of such power and beauty that no darkness could stand against it. The preparations began immediately. Every person who could sing started practicing the most complex piece of music the colony had ever attempted. It would combine every song they had learned, every melody that had given them strength, and every voice that had found courage in the face of terror. The human song was about to become a weapon of ultimate power. The final battle would take place in the colony's central plaza, where the massive shrieker had made its lair. The creature had grown as large as a building by feeding on weeks of human terror, and its presence filled the air with wrongness that made people sick just by being near it. The monster's screams could shatter windows and shake the ground, but the colonists were no longer afraid of its voice. Every person in the colony gathered in the plaza as the sun set behind the red rocky hills. There were nearly 200 humans standing together in the fading light, their voices about to be raised in the most important song in their species' history. Children stood next to adults, families held hands, and strangers became friends, united by the music they were about to create together. Bo Ram took her position at the center of the group, her young voice ready to lead the others into battle against the darkness that had terrorized them for so long. She was no longer just a girl who remembered her grandmother's lullabies. She had become the voice of human courage itself. Her presence gave strength to everyone around her. The massive shrieker emerged from the mining tunnels as full darkness fell. Its body was so large it blocked out the stars, and its eyes glowed with the stolen energy of countless screams. The creature opened its mouth and released a roar that should have sent every human running in terror. But instead of fleeing, the colonists began to sing. Bo Ram started with a simple lullaby about sleeping safely through the night. One by one, other voices joined her until the entire colony was singing together. Their combined song rose into the night air, carrying with it every memory of home and safety and love that the humans possessed. It was not just music. It was the voice of an entire species refusing to surrender to darkness. The shrieker's roar faltered as the human song grew stronger. The creature had never faced anything like this before. Individual voices it could corrupt and destroy, but the combined song of 200 humans was something beyond its understanding. The monster tried to overwhelm their music with louder screams, but the colonists sang even more beautifully in response. Day-ho added his voice to the song, remembering military hymns that had given courage to soldiers facing impossible odds. Hyejin sang work songs her grandmother had taught her about building better tomorrows. Tai Min discovered he could harmonize perfectly, with the children's voices adding depth and strength to their pure melodies. Dr. Yuna sang with the voice of someone who had studied monsters and learned they could be defeated. The song evolved as it continued growing more complex and beautiful. With each passing moment, different groups sang different parts, creating harmonies that wove together like a musical tapestry. The lullabies became work songs, which became hymns, which became something entirely new, a piece of music that had never existed before and would never be sung exactly the same way again. The effect on the massive shrieker was dramatic and terrible. The creature's screams grew weaker as the human song grew stronger. Its enormous body began to shrink and fade as all the energy it had stolen was drained away by the power of fearless voices. The monster that had fed on human terror was being destroyed by human joy, human unity, human refusal to surrender to fear. Other shriekers throughout the colony began to dissolve. As the song reached them through the communication system, the smaller creatures that had hidden in dark corners and deep tunnels could not resist the overwhelming power of human music broadcast at full volume. Every monster in the colony was being destroyed simultaneously by the same beautiful song. The massive shrieker made one final desperate attempt to fight back. It tried to sing its own corrupted version of the human melody, hoping to turn their weapon against them. But the creature had no understanding of harmony or beauty or love. Its twisted music only made the human song stronger by contrast, like darkness that makes light shine brighter. As the monster's body became more transparent, its screams turned into something that almost sounded like pleading. The ancient creature that had fed on fear for countless ages was experiencing something it had never known before: the sound of beings who refused to be afraid. Even as it dissolved, the shrieker seemed amazed by the music. That was destroying it. Boram's voice rose above all the others as she sang the final verse of her grandmother's most beautiful lullaby. The words spoke of stars that watched over sleeping children and love that conquered all darkness. The massive shrieker gave one last weak cry that sounded almost grateful, then dissolved completely, leaving only empty air where a nightmare had been moments before. The colonists' song continued even after the monster was gone. Their voices filled the night with music that celebrated victory over darkness and the power of people standing together. The fear that had ruled their lives for weeks was gone, replaced by the joy of knowing they had found something stronger than any monster, their own human. Voices raised in courage as the last notes of the song faded into silence. The colony was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the peaceful quiet that comes after a storm, filled with the memory of voices raised in triumph. The mining equipment hummed in the distance, and somewhere a night bird began to call. The sounds of normal life were returning. The creatures that had fed on screams had learned something they never expected. Human beings could make sounds that were more powerful than terror. Voices raised together in song could drive back any darkness and defeat any monster. The colony had discovered that their greatest weapon was not technology or violence, but something uniquely human: the ability to create beauty even in the darkest times. Deep in the abandoned mining tunnels, no monsters stirred. The shriekers had learned to fear something they had never encountered before: the sound of humans who refused to be silenced by fear. The colony was safe, and the galaxy had learned that humanity possessed a weapon against darkness that no other species had ever imagined. The mining colony was quiet now, but it was the good kind of quiet, filled with the promise of voices that would sing again when they were needed. The humans had won not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through something much more powerful: the simple act of making music together when everything seemed hopeless. Their songs had saved them, and their songs would save others. In the days that followed the victory, the colonists would return to their normal lives, but they would never forget what they had learned. Music was more than entertainment. It was a weapon against despair, a shield against fear, and a bridge between people that no monster could destroy. The galaxy was a little bit safer because a small group of humans had remembered how to sing.